All right, welcome to episode 8 of our online teaching experiment. We're talking, the big topic we've been talking about is America's other civil war, and we've gotten to the rise of populism. And to summarize, farmers are just like industrial workers, a group of exploited people in this economy, and they're being hammered by certain things. They're being hammered by government policy, where they reduce the money supply because they believe that money should be based on silver and gold. After they had printed all these greenbacks that were purely paper currency, they withdrew those from currency. As the money supply shrank, the prices farmers got for their crops dropped dramatically. For instance, cotton went from 15 cents a pound in 1870 to 5 cents a pound in 1900. Just imagine if your income was cut 66% by your boss, even though you're doing the same amount of work or even more. Secondly, middlemen was the term they used to refer to businesses farmers had to deal with to get their products to the market. Those middlemen, the railroad companies, the warehouse owners, etc., are grossly overcharging farmers to the point that they drive them to bankruptcy or near bankruptcy. There are farm foreclosures all over the country. The government not only reduces greenbacks in the currency, but they're worried about the price of gold, and to prop the price of gold up, they actually withdraw or they stop minting silver coins. So that shrinks the money supply even further. Finally, you have, certain commodities, for instance, cotton, a big issue because the British, when they were cut off from cotton from the American South during the Civil War, began cultivating it in places they control either economically or politically, like India, like Egypt. They began producing cotton, which adds to another big problem for farmers, which is oversupply. Every single commodity farmers produce is being supplied at too high a level, which drives prices down, which again causes farmers often to lose their property. And you have, for instance, in the South, many cotton growers who have been landowners lose their property because they can't pay their mortgages, and they end up as sharecroppers. We're talking about white farmers as well, of course, as African Americans who have been locked into sharecropping during Reconstruction. So there were a wave of farmer protest movements, and we talked about the 1870s, a group called the Grange that at one point has 1.5 million members, and then we had gotten to talk about the alliances. 3 big alliances. These are big farmer groups aimed at improving the condition of farmers. The Northwestern Farmers Alliance, that's in states like Kansas and Nebraska that had stayed in the Union during the Civil War. They're west of the Mississippi River for the most part, where the membership of the Northwestern Alliance is. The most radical of the movements, and the one that calls for programs that are basically socialist in orientation, the Southern Farmers Alliance. And here's something that's really significant, the Colored Farmers Alliance. And what I wanted to get across is the idea that even though there's a separate movement for white Southern farmers, the Southern Alliance, and one for black farmers in the South, the Colored Alliance, they're separated by race. However, they're working together, they're allies. And that is one of the things that makes the populist movement one of the most dangerous in terms of the political status quo radical movements in the U.S. history. They pose a danger to a system that's oppressive, and that's why they're going to be crushed. Now, the alliances are going to try to do a couple of things the Grange did in the 1870s. In the 1880s, the alliances are going to try to, number one, get laws passed that regulate monopoly, that regulate what prices railroads can charge farmers when they transport goods. They're dealing with Republican and Democratic parties that are extremely conservative economically at that point. The Republican Party had been a little bit further left in the age of Lincoln. They become more conservative politically. The Democrats in that era, unlike today, were actually more conservative than the Republicans on economic matters. So they can't get either party to initiate the reforms they want. Secondly, they try to open their own businesses that serve farmers, their own country stores, their own warehouses, etc. Those are called exchanges. Those exchanges, however, are going to run into two problems that the Grange businesses had. That is, number one, that they're trying to operate in hard economic times. There's a depression from 1883 to 1885. Secondly, getting credit from established businesses. Established banks don't want to fund their competitors. And so those are going to be met with futility. Now, there is a movement, however, that does develop. And one of the most historically important moments in this period is in a town called Cleburne, Texas. Cleburne. This is a photograph of Cleburne actually in the second decade of the 20th century. I couldn't find a good photograph of the town in the years we're talking about, 1880s, but some of these buildings in this photograph were around in 1886. This is when Alliance members by the thousands are going to gather into this little Texas town, which is southeast of Fort Worth in Johnson County. Johnson County, it has a border with Tarrant County where Fort Worth is. And it's interesting. That's where my very first professional newspaper job was, Cleburne, Texas. And I don't know if you've noticed, but in Texas, people are often obsessed with the state's history. If you go to Massachusetts, if you go to Boston, they have a rich history, of course. Boston is one of the birthplaces of the American Revolution, but what's interesting in Boston is you can sometimes miss important historical sites. It's really subdued. If you go by where the Boston Massacre took place, there's a marker in the intersection where it happened, but you might not even notice it. Texas, they have historical markers on almost every building. And by the way, if you go to look at them, you pull over, you look at the marker, and it'll say something like, on this site in 1895, a pharmacy opened. And you say, oh boy, I'm so glad I stopped to read that sign. Some things that you might consider fairly trivial are marked with a lot of attention in Texas. There's a historical marker at the college, Collin College, where they note a quote-unquote Indian massacre. I'll note about that language that they call it a massacre if Native Americans defend themselves against white people. When white people slaughter Indians, it's not always called a massacre. But about Cleburne, in 1886, we have a group of populists that are already coming to be known, members of these alliances, gather in that city to compile comes to be known as the Cleburne Demands. And I want to tell you, I can tell you for sure, I worked there. I looked for a marker. There is no historical marker noting that event. And I guarantee you it's the only historically important thing that ever happened in Cleburne, Texas. But I think it's forgotten, maybe deliberately, because of the type of ideas that the populists who draft this document, the Cleburne Demands, make. These are demands the populists make of the two major parties in that era. The list of demands includes a call for the state legislatures in that country and the Congress to regulate railroads, to outlaw land speculation. What's land speculation? That's when you buy land only as an investment. You buy land not to live on it, not to farm on it, not to open a business, but you buy it hoping the value will go up and then to flip it later, to sell it later. That is making land more expensive for young farmers who are moving away from their mothers and fathers. It makes it more expensive for farmers who are trying to expand their farmland. They want to ban it. And it irritates them especially that many of the land speculators are from outside the country. And it's driving land prices up. They want to ease access to credit for farmers. One of the problems farmers have is when they borrow money, the interest rates are extremely high. So they want to either regulate, or they'd like the government actually to directly loan money to farmers. And by the way, that will become government policy beginning in the 1930s during the Great Depression. That's a widely used tactic to ease the debt burden that farmers face. They also want to inflate the currency. That means they want to expand the money supply. More money in circulation means they can get higher prices for the crops they sell, therefore get more income. So they want the government to once again issue greenbacks. In fact, in the 1870s, there was a political party farmers supported that didn't get much traction called the Greenback Party. They want the government to issue greenbacks again, money not backed by silver or gold. And they want also silver coins minted again, like they had been before the government tightened the money supplies. However, the Democratic and Republican parties, again, on economic issues are very similar, and they ignore these demands, and in fact, they listen more to their big, rich donors. I know that sounds like a totally alien world to you. Well, anyway, this is when we begin to have the government basically continue their policies, and you have the populists consider a radical step. That is the formation of a third political party. So let's talk about third parties real briefly. The last time a third party, meaning a party competing with the two major parties, succeeded was the Republican Party. The two major parties in the 1850s, at the beginning of that decade, were the Democratic Party and what was called the Whig Party, spelled with an H. The Whig Party. The Whig Party falls apart because they can't agree, they can't come to a consensus on slavery. During the same time, the Republican Party forms. The Republican Party is dedicated to stopping the spread of slavery to new states that are added to the Union. That third party, the Republican Party, becomes the second major party. The Whig Party disappears. Why is it hard for third parties to succeed in this country? I would suggest there's several reasons. Number one, people tend to vote, if they vote, the way their parents do. It's sort of like religion. Episcopalian parents raise children who, if they go to church, are Episcopalians. Catholic parents raise Catholic kids. And I don't think most people sit and think about church doctrine or what specific ideas they have about God or heaven or if those things exist, etc. They go to a certain place out of habit. They go to a certain church out of habit. I think the same is often true of politics, that Republican parents raise Republican children, Democratic parents raise Democratic children. That's a powerful tradition. Number two, this is very important. Who writes the laws that determine what parties get on the ballot so you have the option to vote for them? Well, in this era and since the 1850s, 1860s, it's been members of the Democratic and Republican parties. The legislatures determine the requirements for a party's candidates to get on the ballot. Texas, Louisiana, whatever. Those state legislatures are made up of Republicans and Democrats. So they make the rules and the requirements hard enough that it's very difficult for a third party to get on the ballot. You have to get so many signatures on a petition. If you get the candidates on the ballot 1 year, if you're Libertarian or Green Party, if you don't hit a certain number of votes in that election, you have to do the process over again. It's extremely difficult, and that's intentional because the Democrats and Republicans do always agree on one thing: they don't want any more competition. Then finally, because we've been dominated by two parties since the 1850s. That means that people assume that's the only options available. There are a lot of cultural, political forces that lead you to think that a vote for a third party is wasted. Why bother to vote for a candidate who has no chance to win? And that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so that really does turn out to shape people's ideas about what's possible, what isn't possible. So we're going to have the populace run into this when they decide to form a third political party, which is officially known as the People's Party. It will eventually be known as more commonly as the Populist Party. They're adding ideas. They're becoming more and more radical. And one of the more radical ideas is proposed by this man here. His name is C.W. McCune. McCune is from Texas. And McCune, his name is spelled M-C-C-U-N-E. C.W. McCune. I'll write it down here on the board. He comes up with a pretty ingenious idea known, and let me write it here, it's called the Sub-Treasury Plan. So this is a little complicated, so let me break it down for you. The sub-treasuries, these would be government institutions open across the country. And the sub-treasuries would function as a combination government warehouse, lender, country store. So how would that work? Well, farmers grow their crops each year. They bring the crops to the sub-treasury. And there they could store non-perishable crops in government facilities, and they'd weigh them, and you would open an account with the sub-treasury, and then they check what the prices those commodities are selling for. So if you're growing cotton, they'd see what the price of cotton is, what the sales price is. If it's below the level that would be necessary for the farmer to make a profit, they'd store the cotton to keep it off the marketplace. In other words, reducing the supply, which inevitably would cause prices to rise, okay? Now, there's a problem. Farmers can't do this themselves. If they hold their cotton off the marketplace, they don't make any money. And they've already invested money, borrowed money to grow the cotton. Here's where the sub-treasury is a major improvement. They would hold the cotton or the corn or the wheat, etc., until the prices rose, and then they would give a low interest loan to the farmers so they could begin the next cycle, planting, harvesting, etc. And then when the cotton prices reach, or the wheat price or whatever, reach profit level, then they'd release that into the marketplace. You'd get the money, you the farmer would get the money, you'd pay off your low interest loan, and presumably then you'd have enough left over to make a profit. The idea is to make loans cheap, credit cheap, but also to make the supply go down, solving the two major problems. This would be, a big improvement for farmers. Now, this idea is going to be ridiculed and thought to be really impractical. What's interesting is, in the 1930s, the government does a version of this during the Great Depression under Franklin Roosevelt, the Roosevelt administration. Instead of having these warehouses and holding back crops, in storehouses or whatever, they're going to be much more direct. They're going to provide farmers subsidies. What does that mean? That's a direct government payment to a farmer. And in this case, farm subsidies are aimed at, very often, paying farmers to not produce certain things. So, I'm sorry, is that kind of hard to read? Okay, here we go. Okay, so you get a payment from the government to not produce certain things. So for instance, if you're growing 100 acres of cotton, the government comes there, they're saying, we have overproduction of cotton, here's a check, grow nothing on 40 of the acres. And you get the money from that deal. This becomes very controversial with food crops, for instance. During the Great Depression, people are hungry, but the government will sometimes, be paying farmers not to grow food Sometimes they'll destroy it. They'll go to hog farmers and they'll purchase the pigs and they'll slaughter them and then bury their bodies or burn them while people are hungry. And that causes a real big emotional reaction. There's a lot of, but the idea is if farmers go under financially, food production's harmed. And in fact, those policies do, in the end, allow at least some of the better off farmers to thrive, and the oversupply problem is really checked. But anyway, so in some ways, what the populists are calling for in the 1890s, ideas that get ridiculed by the quote-unquote smart economists at the time, actually a version of those ideas become policy in the 1930s. Now, in addition, as the populists form a political party, they're going to call for excessive land bought for speculative purposes by foreign investors and by railroad companies to be seized by the government. The government takes that land over, and they distribute it to poor farmers for free. This is socialism, right? So they're really branching into a very radical direction. They call for government ownership of the railroads. Government just take it over. It's a public utility. It's operated like many cities have their own water departments. It would be the same thing. They call for, again, inflating the currency, addressing the tight money supply, coining silver, printing greenbacks. But by the time the populists formed the People's Party, they realized they need support from people just other than just farmers. They need to appeal to all those exploited urban workers. So here are some ideas they embrace to appeal to people in cities. They call, for instance, for the 8-hour workday. By law, you cannot be forced to work more than 8 hours a day. They call for the abolition of convict labor. Again, prisoners are being exploited as unpaid workers in the fields, and that's allowed under the wording of the 13th Amendment. They want to abolish that because that takes jobs away from workers who could earn wages. They call for the secret ballot. What does that mean? When you vote, your vote's not publicly known. That sounds strange, I know. You kind of assume that's always been the case. It hasn't been. In a lot of locations, for instance, in the United States, when you go to vote, you vote by something called vada voce. That's Latin. What does that mean? You vote by voice. The election judge sits there, and you show up to vote, and he says, okay, Joe Earl, how do you vote for mayor? Well, I vote for Jim Bob, and that everyone hears how you're voting, and it's publicly recorded. Very often, the clerk will receive, in some locations, your ballot, and he puts it in the ballot box. And by the way, parties sometimes pre-print ballots with the names already marked off because a lot of people are illiterate. But you can see, and to help the illiterate voters, sometimes the ballots are color-coded. The ballot for a Republican Party might be one color, the ballot for a Democrat another, so everyone knows how you're voted. Why would this be an issue? Well, particularly if you're voting for radicals, like the populists. That could be a problem if you want credit, if you're a sharecropper, the landowner you're working for may not like that you're voting at all, but he might particularly not like if you're in the South, if you're voting for a Republican or you're voting for a populist, you could be kicked off the land. There's all kinds of pressure that can be put on you if your ballot's not secret. That has not become standardized until the 20th century. Efforts to protect the secrecy of who you vote for. Another thing that we take for granted, in this era, we're still under the rules set by the Constitution in 1789, that people don't vote for senators. The state legislatures pick senators. So they're calling for people to be able to directly vote for their senators. Finally, the right of referendum and recall of elected officials. We'll talk about that next time and continue on our conversation about the populists.